We often hear about the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, the millions of Africans taken across the seas, shackled in chains. But what if I told you that in some cases the betrayal came from within? Kings, queens, and even parents across Africa who sold their own people to slavery. This isn't just a tale of invaders and victims. It's a far more complex and sometimes shocking story of complicity. The reality of the transatlantic slave trade. Before we dive into the complexities, let's set the stage. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a European affair. From the 15th to the 19th century, over 12 million Africans were captured, sold, and shipped to the Americas. While European powers like Portugal, Spain, and Britain dominated the seas and built the ships, the process of capturing and selling slaves often started much closer to home. In fact, European traders rarely ventured deep into the African interior. Instead, they relied on powerful African intermediaries, kings, chiefs and traders who were all too willing to trade prisoners of war, criminals, or even their own people in exchange for weapons, textiles and other goods. It's a side of history many prefer not to talk about. The complicity of African rulers and elites in the very trade that devastated their lands for centuries. Power, war and slavery. Why African leaders participated. So why did African leaders sell their own people? The answer is complex. Some rulers saw the slave trade as a means of survival. Others used it to amass wealth and power, and in some cases, it was simply a byproduct of internal wars. Let's talk about the Kingdom of Dahomey. The rulers of Dahomey were known for their fierce military campaigns against neighboring tribes. And as prisoners of war piled up, the Dahomey elite saw an opportunity. Instead of simply killing their enemies, they sold them. The result? Dahomey became one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in West Africa. But this wealth came at a cost, one that would eventually weaken the very kingdoms that participated. The Ashanti Empire, a double-edged sword. The Ashanti Empire, another powerful kingdom, also played a key role in the trade. At its height, the Ashanti were one of the largest slave suppliers to the British, trading prisoners of war from their military campaigns. But the Ashanti didn't just trade for guns and goods. They saw the slave trade as a necessary evil to protect their kingdom from the same fate. You see, if they didn't sell slaves, they feared becoming slaves themselves. The Ashanti were constantly at war, surrounded by rivals. The trade gave them the tools to defend their empire. So while the Ashanti grew in power, they were trapped in a vicious cycle: sell or be sold. Families torn apart, parents selling their own. But it wasn't just kings and queens who participated in this tragic system. In some cases, desperate families, parents, sold their own children into slavery. Why? Sometimes it was out of sheer desperation. During famines or economic hardship, families faced impossible choices. Do they starve together, or does one child get sold to feed the rest? In other cases, it was a way to settle debts, with children being used as collateral. It's hard to comprehend, but the brutality of the era forced many to make unthinkable decisions. Competition, collusion and the slave trade. You see, the slave trade wasn't just a European versus African issue, it was a complex web of competition and collusion. African kingdoms were constantly at war, and selling prisoners was a way to weaken rivals and gain an upper hand. If one kingdom refused to trade slaves, its enemies could profit by selling their own captives. Even neighboring tribes who didn't participate in the slave trade directly were impacted. They became targets of slave raids, with rivals selling them to the highest bidder. In this chaotic world, everyone was looking out for themselves. The trade became a brutal survival game, with some African leaders colluding to keep their enemies weak while keeping European traders satisfied. The Congo Kingdom, a battle against compromise. Not every African ruler was willing to play this deadly game. King Alfonso I of the Congo famously resisted the slave trade. He initially welcomed the Portuguese, but when he saw them taking more and more of his people, Alfonso wrote letter after letter, pleading with the Portuguese king to stop the raids. But his cries fell on deaf ears. The trade was simply too profitable, and the Congo's ability to resist was slowly undermined by European greed and military might. It's a tragic tale of how even those who fought against the trade were ultimately overpowered by its sheer momentum. The moral complexity of compromise. So, does this make these kings and queens, these parents and traders, villains? It's a difficult question. Many were navigating a world of impossible choices. The European demand for slaves was insatiable, and African rulers were caught in a deadly compromise. Do they trade their own people for survival or face destruction? The truth is, in many cases there were no easy answers. The slave trade was a system that exploited everyone, both the enslaved and those who participated in it. The harsh reality. No innocence in the slave trade. There's no escaping it. Complicity in the slave trade is a harsh reality. African leaders, merchants, and even families played a role in the system that saw millions torn from their homes. But while some grew rich, many also faced the devastating consequences. Kingdoms crumbled, populations were decimated, and Africa was left weakened, ripe for colonization. This is the dark legacy of the slave trade, a legacy of betrayal, complicity, and destruction. But it's also a legacy we must confront to understand the full scope of African history. Learning from the past why this matters today. Understanding this complex history is crucial. It shows us that history isn't black and white. It's full of moral grey areas, difficult choices, and painful truths. But by acknowledging these stories, we can better understand the forces that shaped Africa and the world. This isn't just about looking back, it's about moving forward with a deeper understanding of our shared past. We can honour the victims of the slave trade, while also recognizing the complicated roles that some African rulers played. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most difficult chapters of African history. If this video opened your eyes, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Share this with others. Let's keep these important conversations going. Together, we can continue exploring the rich tapestry of African history with all its beauty, its pain, and its lessons for today.